Well, hello, viewers and readers of the Erudite Bibliophile with Wanderlust. We are joined today by author Victoria Christopher Murray to talk about her latest novel, Harlem Rhapsody. Welcome, Victoria. And if you could start maybe with a quick description or a brief synopsis of the book for the viewers who are watching who may not have had a chance to read it yet.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And excuse where I am. I told you I'm traveling. But Harlem Rhapsody, I always say Harlem Rhapsody was the book that I was meant to write after writing for 28 years, because it's a book that's kind of brought me full circle. I stand on this on her shoulders. Jessie Redmon Fauset is the face that you should think of when you hear the words Harlem Renaissance. She was the woman who discovered every single Harlem Renaissance writer that you know. She discovered County Cullen when he was 16, Langston Hughes when he was 17, Nella Larson when she was in her early 20s, all the poets, all the writers. And when I say she discovered them, she not only discovered them before they even wrote their very first piece. So we know them as legends. She knew them as kids. And she discovered them, she mentored them, she edited them, and most importantly, as the literary editor of the Crisis magazine, she published all of them first.
Giant.
Giant.
As I've seen your post, you call them sheroes or hidden figures.
Yeah, yeah. And that's I mean, she's both. Because when I think about what she accomplished in the literary world, the literary canon that we have is based on the foundation that she laid. And from not only discovering all of those writers and turning them into the legends that we know today, but she published more novels than anyone during the Harlem Renaissance. Anyone. And she published the very first novel that was about the Black middle class. Very first. And I've been writing about that for 28 years. So it's interesting that I did not know her name.
Well, and I was lucky enough to get to meet you and hear you speak recently at the Indianapolis
Yes.
Book and Author Luncheon. And because
Yes.
of that, everyone who's watching us now is going to be just as gifted and fortunate as I was, because they're going to get to hear some amazing and hilarious stories, plus some deep drop the mic insertions and revelations that you said at that luncheon that I feel like everyone needs to hear. And so,
Wow. Thank you for
first
saying
off,
that. I didn't feel like I was doing that,
oh,
but
wait, everybody, get ready. So first off, the I want to start with your journey as an author. You
yeah.
regaled us with a story of your first masterpiece at age 7 that
Yes.
had all 900 of us at that luncheon rolling, and it introduced you to the world as a writer because you famously said, quote, I came out of my mother's room, I knowing I would be a writer.
Knowing it is the only thing that I knew I was going to do. I didn't know how I was going to get there. But I knew I was going to be a writer. And as I said, and it's so funny because everybody thinks this is hilarious, but it was my truth. I was 7 years old when I wrote that masterpiece. And it wasn't until I was much older that I realized it was a masterpiece because I plagiarized,
That
because
was
it was a story of Betty and the Witch. And Betty was a little girl who wore a red uniform with a hood to school. She had three bears who were her brothers, and three pigs were her sisters. And their best friends lived next door, and they were seven little people. And there was a good witch and a bad witch because I even remember some of the lines I wrote in there. I can't remember what their roles were, but there was a good witch and a bad witch. So it was just everything I knew. They tell you write what you know. When I
right.
was 7, I threw in everything that I knew. But that changed my life. It really did, because even though I wanted to be a writer, I hadn't written anything. And when I wrote that, my parents gave it to my second grade teacher, and she had the entire second grade perform it as a play. Now, when I say that changed my life for lots of reasons, first of all, I was taught the lesson that writing is power, because she told me I could have any role I wanted. I had done little school plays and I had been in ballet shows before then. I never got to play any part I wanted. And all the other children were assigned what they were going to
You're
play.
like,
I
write
got to
the part
choose.
you want.
I did, right? And then I remember some of the rehearsals, but what I remember most was the night of the performance. I remember that a little bit, but what I remember most about it is at the end, we all took our bow. That used to be my favorite part of performing. We took our bow on the stage. Then she had all the other kids go off the stage. She held my hand, walked me to the center, and introduced me to every parent, teacher, and student in that auditorium as the writer. I became a writer that night. I
I love
did.
that.
I really did. That was the first time. And I've always wanted, wished that I could see her and tell her about that moment that has stayed with me forever. Not only me, my sister was talking about it recently because she was in the audience. And she was like, oh, wow, Vicky's going to be a writer. Like she just thought it was a fact from that point forward. Even though it took a very different route to get here, because you can't be what you don't see. Even though I wanted to be, I didn't know how to be. I was a voracious reader. My parents got me books. The librarian got me books. But I didn't know how to become a writer. So I took a kind of a long path and didn't write my very first novel till I was 42 years old.
Well, say her name. We got to put it out there so if someone's watching, it can connect you guys.
Oh my God, her name is Mrs. Asness, Asness. And I was in school in Brooklyn, New York, PS 138.
You know
Can
her
you? I
first
never
name?
thought about that.
Do you know
I
her first?
don't. I bet you
Okay.
my mom, I don't.
You
I
got to
don't
find her
remember.
so
But
to know so she can hear
oh
this.
my gosh, I have wanted her to know this forever.
Yes. Well, we're
Forever.
gonna figure it out.
Yeah.
Well, and then besides that amazing story you told, I kind of alluded earlier, you had all these like I call them drop the mic moments. What moved me so deeply, this is on a more serious note, but oh so important. What moved me so deeply was when you were talking about your mission and purpose as a writer,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
in times like these. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna like loosely quote and paraphrase you here, but you said history, a history that's an untold can be erased. For
Yeah.
every book they ban, I'll write two. And
Yeah.
if they're going to ban books, I'll excavate it.
Yeah.
My art is my active has become my activism. This is my
Yeah.
and then you
Yeah.
further employed everyone in the room, all the readers in the room, and reminded us of our part and our power that we have within as well, and the role we can play in keeping history alive by reading the stories they want to bury.
Yeah, reading them and sharing them. Reading them and sharing them. That's why and I always talk about that because for 25 of my 28 years in writing, I've been writing just contemporary fiction, contemporary women's fiction. And I came over to write The Personal Librarian with Marie Benedict in historical fiction. And then I stayed here because I've never written to a genre before. I just was writing in my heart, but historical fiction is a very specific genre. And I will be here now until the fingers fall off. Because I think that's why I say I was meant to write this book for a time such as this, for a time for when they are totally trying, as you said, to erase my history, to tell me I'm not important enough to have a history, or my history that has existed isn't important enough. And so that's why I say when I bury it, while you bury it, I'm gonna excavate it. While you take the oxygen, and what they're trying to do with all of us is take the oxygen of words away from us and or the oxygen of history, I should say, away from us. And I'm going to just use my words to give us that life back, to just bring it back. And it is, it's my, I always feel like in a time like this, I need to be doing something. And what can I do? And I'm going to use this gift that God gave me to resist. This is my resistance. And I'm glad you mentioned that as readers, we all have a part because I'm a reader too. Reading becomes resistance when you're
Yeah, when
reading
you
what
said
you
that, I
know
was
they
like,
don't.
that, like
Yeah,
you said, the little things we don't realize are. like you said, resistance in themselves, but we don't
Yeah.
realize that.
We don't. And reading is going to become resistance because they're not going that's why they ban books. They don't want you to read them. It's not so much they don't want me to write them.
Yeah,
They don't want you to read them. And so readers become the bigger part of resistance and not only reading because they know they can't take out what's in your head.
right.
They can't take it out. Not yet. They're working
Yeah.
on it, but they can't take it out. And so when we read and then we share, that's the part that's difficult for them.
Yep. Well, and you just mentioned a second ago, you did provide a lot of inspiration too in the room of reminding us that it's never too late for a life pivot or a dream, because you were talking about how you worked over 20 years in the business
20 years.
field and then published your first book at 42, as you said, self-published. And then five of your fiction novels later went on to become Lifetime TV movies.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
similar, we had Fiona Davis at the author luncheon, and she was talking about how she worked as a journalist, but then didn't publish her first book till 45 years old, and then published her first novel at 49. So
yeah.
it boggles my mind to think what women and stories would have been lost and untold if authors like you and Fiona hadn't taken that brave
Hadn't taken
leap.
the time.
Yeah,
And
and provide that
it is a
inspiration.
and you think about it, it's a brave leap because we're already in our mid years, by the time we decided to do this. And so it's kind of like you're very comfortable now and do you really want to do this? But in another way, it's not that brave. It takes courage, but it's what we both wanted to do. You know what I mean? It wasn't that it would have been brave is not the right word, but it would have been much easier if I hadn't
Yeah,
done it.
right.
It would have been just much easier and more comfortable and everything. I had to do it
Yeah.
because I always wanted to do it. And I didn't, my husband was the one that really kind of pushed me over the edge. He was always so proud that I wanted to be a writer and bought all kinds of computers every year, a new computer for me. And finally, but I allowed life to get in the way. Oh, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it next year. I'm going to do it. And finally, he said, okay, I'm not going to ask you anymore, but one day you're going to be 80 years old and you're going to be sitting on somebody's porch, rocking in somebody's rocking chair, saying, my God, I didn't even give it a try.
Oh my
And
goodness.
that scared me.
Yeah.
That scared me. And that's for anybody who wants to do anything. I had I desire to write and I had a resistance to write. And all through the years, my resistance was higher than my desire. And all those words did was move my desire higher than my resistance.
Or
And I
quiet
think
that
you have
noise.
yeah, quiet the noise, nothing's going to get in the way. And that's why I said I had to do it. I had to, because I couldn't be 80 and say,
Right.
man, the one thing I wanted to do in life, I didn't even try.
Right. Right. Thank gosh for us. Well, and in this novel that you penned, Harlem Rhapsody, you kind of talked earlier about how we learn in the novel just how prolific Jessie Redmon Fauset's writing was, and what an instrumental key player she was in the Harlem Renaissance, and her impact and success as a leader and voice at the Crisis magazine. Um,
Yes.
but however, as you started researching her after you discovered her through this podcast series, Harlem on My Mind, that there wasn't a lot of information out there. You even said in the luncheon, you kind of brought up like if you Google search the face of the Harlem Renaissance, she's not even going to be the face that pops
Yeah.
up, despite the fact you said in the book she was, quote, the midwife of the movement, despite the fact
Yeah.
she had a hand in and touched every significant writer, like you said, from teenagers like County Cullen and Langston Hughes, yet there was this, you know, not hardly anything out there about her. She was virtually unknown. And like you said, you didn't even discover her till after this podcast series.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
in the luncheon, you kind of alluded to several reasons why that might have been, but I thought
Yeah.
maybe you could talk a little bit more in depth for the viewers that are here,
Gotta listen. Yeah.
kind of what those you believe those could be.
Well, the first thing is she was a woman, and 100 years ago, women did not have careers. And so she was doing something totally out of the ordinary anyway. She was already, and so people still kind of pushed her aside. And even though they were like, yeah, Jesse, you discovered Langston.
Yeah.
Now, Langston, come up here because
Right.
he was a man and more important than her. So that was one reason. The second reason I really believe is because she was having an affair with W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois was arguably, well, I don't think you can even argue with this. He was the most educated Black person at the time. He had an undergraduate degree from Fisk, and then when he went to get his master's at the University of Massachusetts, they didn't accept his credit, so he had to get another undergraduate degree, then a master's degree, then he got his PhD from Harvard. And this is only 50 years after the end of slavery, just 50 years. Like when I was a teenager, 50 years sounded like 500 years. But
Right.
from where I sit now,
Yeah.
50 years sounds like last Tuesday.
Right.
And so I just, he was this man who had done so much, had accomplished so much, was trying to change not just America, but the world and have equality all over. He had founded the Crisis magazine, was one of the founders of the NAACP, all of these accomplishments. And here comes this young cutie that he only created the position so that she would be in the same state as him. She was in Washington, D.C., he was in New York, and he created the position of literary editor. We know he created it because there was no literary editor before her, there was no literary editor after her. Jessie Redmon Fauset is the only person who's ever held that title for the Crisis magazine. And here comes this woman who he minted just for personal pleasure. Of course, he thought she was smart and everything, so he thought she could help, but he didn't know she was going to help and create an entire movement. And she began getting the credit. I mean, the magazine was soaring and thriving, and she was getting the credit. And he was a little ticked by it. And so when they broke up at her, she was the one that broke them up, and they did remain friends through the years. But when people talked about what the crisis had accomplished, I am absolutely sure he was like, "Thank you very much, I did it. Thank
Yeah.
you very much, I
Yeah.
did it." And then the third thing is something that you said, but I really want to touch on it a little bit more. Um, a history that is untold is a history that's going to be erased because 100 years have passed since Jessie Redmon Fauset lived. And each year, her name became less and less and less and less and less until 100 years. And thank God I found a podcast, and who knows how they found it, but just little pieces. If I hadn't heard that podcast and no one had written her story, in another 100 years, she'd be gone,
Yeah.
totally gone. And so when you don't tell the stories, it is much easier for them to be erased. And that people were not telling, no one was out there telling her story.
For sure, for sure. Well, and then the title that you have, the Harlem Rhapsody, you kind of talked about, you said when she went from DC to New York, in the opening pages of the book, you kind of captivate us with the sounds of Harlem. You have the neighborhood sounds of laughter of the men at the barber shop and the
Yeah.
girls skipping in the street, and then the sound of Mamie Smith's Harlem Blues
Yeah.
on the record player. And that's the Harlem Rhapsody that she hears upon arrival. But then towards the end of the book, when her departure from New York, in the last pages of the book, now she hears poetry, and
She
each
hears the,
line of the poetry is a different line from each of her famed mentees that make up this poem. From, a line from County Cullen, and then the next line is Langston Hughes, and then the next line is Jean Toomer, and the next line is Gwendolyn Bennett. And so now that becomes the poem of the Harlem Renaissance and the new Harlem Rhapsody. That's the new music of words, the new sound of Harlem. So how did you come up with that title and that opening and closing sequence, like you said, where of her arrival in, and these are the sounds that she hears and her departure. Now, this is the music that she is going out, which would, like you said, would have been virtually impossible. This poem would have virtually been impossible without Jessie Redmon Fauset.
Without her. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
And so, it's so funny. I can write 400 pages of a novel and I cannot come up with a three-word title. I mean, it takes forever. So this was a group effort. It was me, my agent, my editor, the head of sales, the head of publicity, the head of marketing, and they were taking it to people. And I remember at one point my agent said, "We're never going to have a title for this book. We are never going to get a
Like
title."
nothing was doing like the light bulb or the
Nothing was doing.
thing.
The very first thing we wanted to call it was the Book Muse of Harlem. And so that kind of worked for me because that's what she
Yeah.
was. But for, different people, it wasn't catching them. They didn't like the muse. I liked the
Yeah.
muse. Um, then they said, well, the muse is good, but then when you have to put a book with it, and interestingly, Harlem Rhapsody came up pretty early, but people were concerned that Rhapsody, people think of music. Although one of the definitions of Rhapsody is extreme excitement and enthusiasm. And that's what she had for Harlem was extreme excitement and enthusiasm. I mean, we had other good ones too. Like a love letter to Harlem with love or something
Oh, I
like
like
that.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, that would have been a good one. Then my agent came up with a horrible one, The Lady of Lenox Avenue. I was like, oh my God, she sounds like she's standing on the street corner. But we all, you when you're coming up with a title, you just throw them out and
Right.
then you start scratching them off.
Right.
And I
Can't
think
get a title without trying them all. You know?
trying them all. So somebody has to tell you, no, The Lady of Lenox Avenue is not good.
Well,
So
but that with poetry, you know how it does have that sing-song quality.
yeah,
If they
yeah,
the pentameter writer, the rhyming, like it has a musical tempo and quality to it. So it does tie into the, even though if people think
yeah.
of music, then
Yeah. And so she loved it because of the alliteration and everything.
yes,
But it was fun. It was a fun process, although it's not fun when you're going through it,
yes.
because you do feel like, oh my God, I am never ever going to get a, t- a title.
You're like, there's this deadline, so we need something.
Yeah, because they were already working on the cover, which is painted,
Oh, that it's beautiful.
unusual.
Oh, let me hold it up so that if people like,
Yeah, I love that cover. That's a painted cover. Most of the time for novels, they take stock photos. And with AI, you can make it look really good. I mean, sometimes they'll get a model to come in, but what Berkeley wanted with this cover was a piece of the Harlem Renaissance. They didn't want to just recreate, you take somebody else's art and put it on there. They wanted something that would look like a painting from the Harlem
I love
Renaissance.
that.
And they hired a painter. Who does that?
I saw, isn't he like Argentinian or Spanish or something?
Yeah, yeah. His name is in the back jacket
But
on the cover, on the inside cover of the back jacket.
David
And
J.
so,
Mascaris for everybody. David J.
yeah.
Mascaris.
And so he looked up the colors of the Renaissance. He looked up everything to get it right, and he nailed it.
Yes, he did.
Because everybody, when they read the first chapter and the last chapter, they feel like that's the first chapter. Like he captured the whole first chapter of all the music and all of the
Yep.
activity. And yeah, I love the back cover with the little people dancing on the back cover too. Yeah, it's great.
Um, well, and many times, you're kind of talking about how things fall into place and hit just right, like with the title and things. And many times when you talk to authors, they talk about serendipitous moments that happen or crazy coincidences or signs when they're like researching and writing their novel. And you
Mm.
talked about in the historical notes in the back of your book, when you were researching, finding out that your friends mother's baby
Yeah.
picture was on the children's edition
Yes.
of The Crisis, and then also learning that Jessie was a SOAR alum of your
Yeah.
sorority, Delta Sigma Theta, and had been
Yes.
initiated a century ago, 100 years ago, to your sorority. So,
Yeah. That was so when I found out first that Delta Sigma Theta, my sorority, helped her and the NAACP send her to Brussels for that big speech she gave for the Pan African Congress. So I was really excited because I was like, oh, I'll get to mention my sorority. And then they said she was a member of Delta Sigma Theta. And that bothered me a little bit because she was having an affair with W.E.B. Du Bois. And I wasn't quite sure I wanted one of my sorority sisters to be told in that light. So it's very interesting, though, Erin, because I'm telling you, if I had known that she was a member of Delta when I found out she was having an affair before I started the book, I probably wouldn't have written her story.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I didn't know. I
Like
didn't know
that's
until I
why
was,
the timeline
that's
plays out the
why,
way.
yeah, yeah, I couldn't, I would have, I am 99% sure I would not have written her story. I would have found some other story to write.
Well,
Because didn't want a member of Delta Sigma
right,
Theta doing that. So,
right.
but yeah, it's what it is. But it was so much fun to find out that one of my dear friends from high school it was her mother who was on the cover. And what was so interesting was how important her mother was on that cover because they had a children's edition every October, which they had stopped because they had the children's magazine. Well, when the children's magazine went out of business, they had to come back, and her mother was chosen as the very first child model. She wasn't even 2 years old. She was 18 months old when they took a picture. So her mother, and it was so cool to
And
put
it was like that
that.
probably gave you such feeling of like validation of like I should be this is another touch point or keystone to show that I should be writing this story. I'm in the
Definitely.
right path. What did your friend say? Like what?
Well, she was excited about it. I mean, she was very excited. She knew that her mother was on the cover, but she didn't know why.
Right. She just knew that was
And
kind of like
I
a
have,
fact. Yeah.
yeah, it was a family. And so I was the one that found the history for her.
Crazy.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? Because her
That
mother
is
passed away when she was very young, when we were young.
oh
And
wow.
so this was just so wonderful for me to find out that history for her.
I love that. Well, and
Yeah.
like you said earlier, the reasons why um that maybe her history was a little unknown, that almost became one of the reasons why you didn't we're going to maybe write the book because of that.
Yeah, that affair. And see, that's a good point, Erin. I always say that affair stopped her from being told, and I almost participated in that.
But here we are.
Here we, and I'm so glad. And it hasn't come without its okay, trouble is a big word. That's not what it is, but it hasn't come without a few people saying they don't like the affair. They feel like the story could be told without the affair. All of that. And what people who say that don't know is that as writers, we're not just writers, we're kind of like mechanics and engineers. And we thought about all of that before.
Right.
Because I had already thought about when I discovered she was a member of Delta Sigma Theta, can I write this story without the affair? And then I started saying, okay, well, I'll just have to make up a little lie about why she gets to New York. So that'll take care of the first scene. Then I'll have to make up a little lie about the title of her book. There is confusion. Then I'll have to make up a little lie about, and then I was like, wait a minute, if I'm going to make up all these lies, and who am I to say what's the most important parts of her life? That was her life.
Yeah.
And it's not fair for me to say, no, I'm not going to do this. No, I'm not going to include that. That's not fair. I think that's very selfish and elitist. Even for a reader to say, I don't like that part of her life. That was her life.
Yeah. Can't
So
erase
I'm
it.
glad I wrote it. You can't erase it. And it's not fair to erase it.
Well, and then speaking of like things that kind of, like you said, put it in the right path, you talked in the acknowledgement section of the book how you had turned in three ideas to your executive editor for your first solo historical project. And that wasn't even your first choice,
This
but
wasn't my
then
first choice.
you picked that one and it ended up being the right decision at the right time and the right story for the right time.
Isn't that amazing?
So I was curious what those other two
The
ideas
two were
were. And
okay.
is
So
one
but
of them in contention for your next solo historical project?
So that's really interesting. No, because now I've learned a lot more about historical fiction and how I want to tell it and what I want to tell. And one day I might tell it. But so when I first started looking at what I was going to write as a solo author, my agent said to me, look at the decades that really interest you the most. And it was the 20s and the 60s. And what's so interesting is that I think it's almost for the same reason. As a writer, I'm a visual person. So I see the music,
Wow.
I can hear the music and the fashions and all of that, both of those decades, like
Right.
more than any of the other ones.
Right.
And then also for the same reason, I'm a political nerd, so I love the political climate of both because both for different reasons was a rise of black pride in the 20s. It was the first time ever black people looked in the mirror and started seeing a pride in themselves. And then in the 60s it was a different thing, so I was very interested in the 60s. So I found out that the March on Washington that we all give Martin Luther King all this credit for would never have happened without three women.
Hmm.
So, for example, the march itself was he had one march and A. Philip Randolph had another march, and they were going to do it separately because they were in competition. And one woman, Anna Hedge, brought them together. And I mean, it was work to bring them together. Then, when Martin Luther King got up to speak, he was speaking about how America has bounced a check on Black Americans. That was his speech. And Mahalia Jackson, the famous gospel singer, was sitting behind him. And she looked into the crowd and she could see people were bored, ready to go home. And she had listened to him give a speech the week before at Aretha Franklin's father's church in Detroit.
Wow.
And Mahalia Jackson yelled out to him, tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream. He put aside his speech and spoke the I Have a Dream speech just from memory. What we would have never known without Mahalia Jackson. Then the march needed $100,000 to do it because they had to pay for everything. And so the NAACP gave 10,000, the Urban League gave another 10,000, $20,000, but they still needed $80,000. Judy Garland went and raised the other
Oh
$80,000 in Hollywood.
my goodness.
The March on Washington wouldn't have happened without those three women.
Why do we
And I
not know
just kind
this?
of wanted, and I wanted to tell a fiction story, bringing them
Yeah.
together. Why do we not know this?
Yeah.
And Judy Garland, when that money had been raised, CBS was through with her. She was doing a show, and
Wow.
she couldn't even go to the march because they said, "We will fire you. You will
Yeah,
lose
we
your
don't want
show."
your face. You've already put the money. We don't want the face there too. Yeah. Oh my
And
goodness.
she was sick about it. She was sick.
And
So isn't that a great story?
well,
Isn't that what?
yeah, and the fact that we don't know about even the Mahalia Jackson yelling out.
Yelling out. Yeah, he was telling this horrible speech and he put it aside.
Wow.
And that was only the second time he'd given a speech on I Have a Dream, but that was not what he planned to talk to that day.
Wow.
Not at all. He has
Wow.
no notes or anything else. Everybody else had notes. He had no notes because that wasn't the one. He put his
Yeah.
notes aside. And then, but they would have had two separate marches that would have not had an impact
Are
of
you
what
sure you
those
don't
were.
want that to be your next solo?
Isn't that a good? So that was my number one story. And then my number three, I don't think I'll write it though. I hope somebody does one day because it's more of a young adult story. The Brown versus Board of Education
Oh, yeah.
that finally it it was a whole bunch of different cases that came together. And the major case was brought by young Black kids. It was a young Black girl, I can't remember her name right now, who had gone to school in New York, and then her family moved to Virginia. And when they moved to Virginia, she was in a school that was like in a truck, like a trailer, with water coming in from the ceilings and everything. And the trailer was in the little parking space of a white school. And she's like, we're from New York. We don't do
Right.
this.
Right.
And she organized the march outs and all kinds of protests. She got the NAACP, and they brought her case. Her name is on the case that went before the
Wow.
Supreme Court and won. 17 years old.
That was my next question. How old was she?
17 years old. She was
Wow.
like, we don't have to do this. She disrupted everything. It was really something. So
Wow.
those are the three ideas. And I really wanted to do the March on Washington because I had always wished that I was a tiny, tiny kid. And I
Right.
always wish I had been old enough to go.
Right.
And so I really wanted to do that one. And I told the story of Jessie, and I didn't know all of Jessie. Think about, at that time, I had just listened to a podcast. I didn't know all of her. And then the third one. So the third one, they said, that's too young adult. But my editor said to me, it has to be Jessie.
Yeah.
And I said, really? Really? But I trust my editor. I really do.
Yeah.
And she
Well,
was absolutely right.
and speaking of the right story, the right time, all of that. So to end with a bang and become full circle moment when we're talking about timing, yesterday was the Schomburg Center at the 135th Street Library in Harlem of the New York Public Library turned 100 yesterday.
That's why I'm here.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Because I was going to say
That's why I'm here.
they put out um yesterday a centennial reading list that was put together by the Schomburg Center staff of
Wow.
recommendations of books for adults, teens, and kids. And on this of the 16 books they put for adults, what do you think two of those books were? Full circle. There's Confusion by Jessie Redmon Fauset and Harlem Rhapsody by Victoria Christopher Murray. And I was like, oh my gosh, full circle. Now her
So
book
I
is
didn't even
on the
see that.
list. Yeah, just
Yeah.
yesterday I saw it when they were releasing all the
Yeah,
kind
because
of like
that's
the
why that's
okay,
why I'm here in New York.
there you
Because they invited
go.
me to come up to, but I'm looking now. They gave me a thing. I didn't look at it because I was so excited to just be there.
Right.
And we all marched into the library together. And then I listened to the panels, and one of the panels was about the Harlem Renaissance, and they talked about Harlem Rhapsody, if anyone hadn't read it. And the fact that they sell my books in the Schomburg, and then I don't know if you know this, Erin, but when they were planning my tour, I wanted New York is not a market I come to, even though I'm from New York, because it's such a hard market. New Yorkers are just like, we see people all the time. But I had done all of my research at the Schomburg, at the
Yes.
135th Street Library. And so I said to my publicist, do you think I can do a signing at the Schomburg? And she was like, oh, I don't think so. Well, the Schomburg, they had President Obama
Yeah.
there, you're kind of good, Victoria. And I said, well, just see, because they did know that I was researching
Yeah.
there. They did know that the one of the authors of the personal librarian was doing the research for this book, Harlem Rhapsody. And so she tried and tried, and then they read it, and they said, "Well, we have another library. Does she want to go to the other library?" I said, "Look, it's the Schomburg or bust."
Right.
And they kept asking, and I'm not kidding. It was like a week before my tour was to be released. They
Gosh.
finally said yes, and then, but they put all of these parameters on it, like make sure she gets 100 people. We have to have 100 people there. 250 people came to my signing at the Schomburg. It was a highlight of my career to be.
Oh,
I felt like it felt like I was taking Jessie Redmon Fauset home,
yes.
because that was the library of the Harlem Renaissance. That's where she would meet them a lot of times to edit their work with them. That's where they would go for poetry readings, County and Langston. In fact, Langston Hughes, his ashes are interred there,
Wow.
right there in the Langston Hughes auditorium part of it.
Wow.
And so that's why I'm in New York. I'm so glad that